think everybody's sort of in and clicking the OK prompts. So I think we'll slowly get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's workshop on tutoring in the time of COVID. My name is Julia Rim-Shepherd, and I am the Director of Strategic Communications at the Future Skills Center. It's a pleasure to be here today in such great company, in the company of respected and engaging group of leaders here in education and diversity. And I would like to thank our colleagues at the Diversity Institute for organizing and facilitating this wonderful event. As well, I would like to thank and recognize the valuable input of the research leads at the University of Toronto and Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, before we start, a couple of housekeeping items, as many of you would expect. Please note that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be published widely and publicly after the event. The link will be shared with anyone who has registered, so you can expect that. And after each of today's panels, we'll have a few minutes to answer audience questions. So feel free to go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box during the session. Before we get a little bit into the topic of the day, I want to acknowledge that the Future Skills Center is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. The treaties that cover these territories include the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, and the Upper Canada Treaties. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And as a visitor to this land, I myself strive to deepen my own understanding of the local Indigenous communities and reframe my responsibility to follow Indigenous leaders and actively work towards relearning Indigenous sovereignty and solidarity. Across Canada, our teams and partners similarly gather on traditional territory of many Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. Now, some of you might not be aware of who Future Skills Center is, so just a little bit about us. We launched about 2.5 years ago, and we've been building a future-focused skills innovation hub in Canada to help prepare workers and employers for ongoing labor market change. We work with partners across the country to understand how global trends affect the economy and to research and identify what skills people need to thrive within an ever-evolving environment. And I'm sure you all can understand that. Ever-evolving, all those challenges. We test and measure innovative approaches to skills development and training based on the insights that we unearth with our partners to learn really what's working. And besides bringing this research kind of to the fore and building a community of practice and building a network of those that we can share and learn from, we're really invested in the 140 pilot projects across the country with the hope of sourcing innovation from the ground up, touching every region, sector, and population, really to scale. So the topic of today, so with the accelerating pace of change and particularly the disruption wrought by the pandemic, skills gaps between what employers want and the talent available may be increasing. We've all seen that many sectors of the Canadian economy are undergoing drastic changes due to automation, technological advancement, and of course, the pandemic. And anyone who is a parent, I myself, probably does not need to be reminded how the pandemic has really affected education and disrupted education. There were issues of inequity and systemic barriers in education before COVID-19, but the pandemic has magnified those inequalities. You may have heard the saying, education is the great equalizer. But unfortunately, access to education and experiences in the educational system and opportunities within it have not been equal. So I'm really looking forward to an engaging discussion today as we examine the potential for tutoring to address the equity and learning gaps that have widened in the shadow of the pandemic. We'll be hearing more about tutoring and the importance and the role of tutoring and one-on-one educational support. The research and insights that are shared today really fit with our mandate at the Future Skills Center as we work towards creating a future in which everyone really has lifelong access to learning opportunities and high quality career advice. We aim to contribute to a broader skills development ecosystem within Canada. And for this, we recognize the vital role played by other individuals, organizations, and governments as we collaborate with partners to develop a more responsive, effective, and coordinated skills development ecosystem to help equip people, with the skills and knowledge and tools that they need to survive. I'm particularly interested in hearing from Carl James on these issues. Carl is the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University. So he will be providing today's opening remarks. And so I ask you to join me in welcoming Carl. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. And I will start. I'm very privileged, I think, to be giving the opening remarks, and I very much appreciate the invitation to do so. I titled my talk, Education Recovery Strategies that Address Equity in Education, and I raised the question, is tutoring the way? And I'm going to particularly interested in how we place racial and racialized people in this process. According to Statistics Canada in 2017 report, due to the increase in high skills occupations during the decade 2019 to 2028, 75% of all new jobs will require a post-secondary education. This includes obtaining apprenticeship and trade diplomas and certificates. Canadian data also indicates that only about 50% of eligible Canadians have access to some form of post-secondary education. And just over 60% of Canadians have completed a diploma or degree at the post-secondary level. However, we know that access to post-secondary education and even graduation from high school is not equitably distributed across all social or racial groups. And as Gallagher McKay and her colleagues have shown, there are distinct indicators that can predict who does not go on to post-secondary education. Referencing access to post-secondary education is significant because it's recognized as one of the most influential and instrumental tools available to society. Research has shown that factors such as race, gender, school readiness, academic programs, educational guidance, proximity to post-secondary institutions, support systems, and discriminatory practice help to shape and determine schooling opportunities and educational trajectory of students. Two questions we might consider here are, who are the students who successfully attain the education they need for the careers and social lives to which they aspire? And how might interventions and supports such as tutoring programs help, particularly in our current context in which COVID-19 has operated to exacerbate the inequities faced by young people socially and educationally? We would agree that intervention programs such as tutoring must take into account the ways in which the inescapable inequities in relation to race, class, gender, neighborhood of residence, sexual identification, racism, discrimination, etc., are inherent in the policies and practices of educational institutions, and thereby serve to shape the social and educational experiences, performance, participation, and outcomes of young people. As we consider how we might address the educational problems of students, it is always worth reminding ourselves of the difference between equity and equality. For it is equity we seek to establish. Equity is not achieved by treating everyone or all groups of people the same. Rather, it can only be achieved by treating individuals or group of people differently in relation to their circumstances. Equality, on the other hand, is premised on the idea that everyone, regardless of background or community conditions, have the same access to services and hence should receive the same treatment. And it is believed that it's through individual efforts, people will realize the opportunities and successes they seek. Equality then translates to mean treating everyone the same, but it might not be beneficial. Indeed, Judge Bella in Equality and Opportunity in Employment report of November 1984 wrote that ignoring differences and refusing to accommodate them is a denial of equal access on opportunity. Essentially then, equity requires that the opportunities and services that are provided to various communities must be responsive to their particular needs, concern, ambitions, aspirations, and interests. Doing so requires differential treatment if communities are to realize the outcome that we seek for them. That is, equity requires that we understand the particular barriers and the roots of the barriers and disparities that mediate access and are responsible for conditions in which racialized people find themselves. These barriers must be addressed in the services we provide. Barriers related to access is of particular concern. I say this because of the tendency to overlook race in our everyday relations in our society, or the idea of representing racialized members of our society as a whole in the aggregate. And using the term visible minority, given that to us as if to lump all these differences together. We must consider how race might be operating in people's lives, and we must pay attention to and recognize how all of us, irrespective of who we are, mediate our social environment, our society, and our relationship through race. So when we consider the effects of COVID-19 and how it has disrupted schooling and education for more than 20 months now, we can agree that we need to do something about education for our young people. For things such as school closures and remote learning have created enormous challenges for students, their parents, and educators. Education experts Gallagher McKay and her colleagues write that the percentage of students choosing remote learning compared to in-person schooling may reflect the racial geographies of Canadian urban centers. A number of reports from the Greater Toronto area show that families living in neighborhoods with lower incomes and with more racialized residents are more likely to choose online schooling. And in Canada generally, COVID-19 risks are found to be disproportionately higher in communities with higher household density, higher proportion of essential workers, lower educational attainment, lower income, and more racialized residents. This assertion is supported by Global Mail reporters who in 2020 summer write of the disproportionate effects that COVID has on marginalized and racialized low-income communities in Toronto. The fact is, COVID served to exacerbate the systems of embedded inequities of which education is a major foundational pillar, thereby adding to the problems of those most vulnerable. Garner and Wilson cite racism as a particular contributor to the educational situation of students. They write that it is itself a rampant epidemic which restricts individuals' airflow, stifles the ability to breathe, and move freely, and constricts their health and productive lives. Given today's school and education situation, I'm suggesting that we need to reimagine schooling and education. And the program of tutoring may serve as a very useful tool in this reimagination. And what I would say further are some of the things that this reimagination will have to take into account and address. Inadequate academic support is one area. Studies have long shown that breaks from schools are notorious for widening achievement gaps. For instance, gaps in mathematical literacy skills, mathematical and literary skills between children from lower and higher socioeconomic backgrounds often widens during vacation periods from school. These gaps tend to be the result of low-income families' inability to afford supplementary academic or extracurricular programs that could contribute to their children's intellectual development while away from school. So being out of school and accessing less hours of learning and or engaging in online learning could further these students' lowered school participation, academic performance, and educational outcomes. We should be especially concerned also here, and I reference, students who enter high school going from grade 8 to grade 9 based on a transfer and not promotion. Such students have difficulty in catching up and sometimes may never catch up simply because they did not meet the educational requirements or expectation in that transfer process. Mental health and social distances is also some of the things to consider here, because being out of school and isolated from friends have contributed to educational problems. Essentially, months of physical distancing, social separation, and in some cases, self-isolation, and also poor internet connections, and students having to prepare for classes without the necessary assistance, and the absence of socialization and sensory features of in-person schooling can contribute to a disadvantageous learning experience. This means that students would have lost critical peer-to-peer learning opportunities and teacher-to-student instructions. And I also think here often of how students might not ask questions of teachers sometimes, but in teaching a course might, when they look at students' faces, might understand that the student might not understand what's being said and might go over it. So not having that in-person connection will play a role in students advancing in their education. American studies have shown that teachers consistently reported that they were unprepared to teach online and taught less standard material to their students, and students are increasingly disengaged from learning. A significant percentage of them did not even log in or make contacts with the teacher. These issues are especially evident in high poverty urban schools. And I've talked to students who sometimes never ever turn on their cameras, and all those kinds of things have something to do with that social interaction and the relationship that might be built during these online learning. Middleton makes the point that deviation from usual classroom instruction practices have created additional variance in test scores so that the ability to compare the same students' test performance relative to others across last year and this year will be problematic. Clearly, students without the language and the social and cultural capital of the school, as represented through the teacher, for instance, lower income and racialized students and those with disabilities, will have to work harder to pick up on the subtleties, nuances, and slight delays expressions of teachers and their peers if they show that their faces if they do not show their faces on screen. And this idea of working harder is one of those notions that I always heard from Black students, especially whom I interviewed, who always thought that they had to work harder to prove themselves. And you can understand how that's exacerbated with this kind of teachers. They interviewed for their newspaper articles, watched helplessly as certain students simply disappeared. And in the case of one elementary teacher, she quote, she lost touch with nearly half of her students. So people have suggested that online learning allows, some people have suggested that online learning allows for equal opportunities and reduces inequities, but this is not the case. Rather, it operates as an extension of an inherent disadvantaged system that further exacerbate the conditions in which social and cultural hierarchies are entrenched. Based on research on the promise of e-learning in Toronto District School Board, Fahadi concludes that the approach to e-learning is premised on a meritocratic political philosophy in which students' differences are obviated, course content is delivered, and as a one-size-fits-all across a diverse range of learners, and contradictory assessment practices is conflated by mastery and feedback which do not reach the students, and grades are assigned accordingly. In some interviews that I've done recently with students in the GTA, here are some of the things that the students have said to me about their education during this time. And these are students who are in grade 9 and 11. And here what Becca, who said, I would say that a majority negative, I have had a majority of negative experience when it comes to schooling during the pandemic. I feel like in some of the courses, I definitely feel severely. Ray had this to say. We missed out on a lot of stuff that we could have potentially done if only we were in person. Anna added, they cared more about, they, meaning the teacher, cared more about giving us the work and having it submitted. And on multiple occasions, I was there to pass, not to learn. So unfortunately, online learning did not do it for me. Jita said, when online, I found that I had to push myself. Teachers were just giving us the information. And if you wanted to learn, you had to go learn on your own. And I think that was the downfall of a lot of students this year. Like teachers didn't realize that we're still young, we're still children. Like sometimes we just don't know how to get the resources of our own. So where do we go from here? How might we imagine education differently? Given the schooling and education issues we are forced to confront today, we should concede that while schooling might have worked for some, for others, particularly racialized and marginalized students and their parents, schooling has not been working. As such, the current context presents an opportunity to reimagine education and schooling in an accessible and responsive way to the students and their parents, especially those for whom existing policies, programs, curricula, and practices have silenced their voices, stifled their potential, and limited their successes. It is imperative that we, as we contemplate a program of education that will best serve the needs and interests of all students and their parents, it is important to give special attention to racialized, low-income people for whom the system of education is consistently failing. We must build a schooling and education system that values and hence serve the students and their families. Tutoring could be a part of that effective educational strategy for reimagining schooling and education for today's generation of students, and I say from elementary to university. And I said today's generation of students because I'm thinking it's not going to be just simply elementary school, but we have to think of this generation of students throughout the whole education system. I think of university. I think of students who have gone to university in their first year and having a very unusual first year university program, and similarly second year and so forth. So it's going to right across the education system. We should think about what's happening to education and how we might want to think of education differently, how we might reimagine the schooling and the education that we're providing. In doing so, we have to address the systemic issues related to the curriculum that we present, the educational materials, and the absence of what is lacking in educational system. We need to contribute to building students' sense of self and encourage them in their exercise of agency. We have to support the development of curriculum and resource materials that are culturally relevant and responsive to their needs, interests, and aspirations. So if tutoring is going to come in and do some of these things, we have to consider how that might be constructed, how we might set that out, and who's doing the tutoring. And of course, we have to start thinking of who's doing the tutoring, just as we're thinking now of who the teachers are teaching. We're going to have to consider that, because there has to be some relationship between the people who are constructing the curriculum, who are doing the teaching, and who are meeting and working on enabling students and knowing the background of the students in order to satisfy their interests and needs. How much the tutor understands the interests and expectations of students and not reinscribe the problem that the students lack is important here. We must help students to understand the educational situation is not necessarily something of their own making, but help them to understand the situation educationally is also in relation to the social system and the institutional structures in which they are being educated. So we have to start working at those. And I think it's an opportunity right now to really work towards building an educational system that will be responsive to the students we serve. Thanks very much. We go on into the next session. And the next session is titled Accelerating the Learning and Addressing Educational Inequities, How Tutoring Can Help Us Learn Our Way Out of the Pandemic in Toronto. The speakers will be Karen Mundy, Kelly Gallagher-McKay, and Mohammed Elmi. And the moderator is Stephen Hurley. And I pass it over to Stephen. And I hope some of those points that I made will be taken up. Of course, I'll be want to be in some of those sessions while you ask some of the questions and challenge some of the points I made, hopefully. Thanks very much for listening. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. James, and a compelling and heartfelt beginning to this afternoon. And I wanted to thank you for inviting me to be moderator here on this first panel conversation, Accelerating Learning and Addressing Educational Inequities. I love the subtitle of this, How Tutoring Can Help Us Learn Our Way Out of the Pandemic in Toronto. Joining me today, I'm going to introduce panelists in a moment. I will remind you that this event is being recorded. If you're just joining us, the event is being recorded and that recording will be published publicly after the event. At the end of today's first panel conversation, we'll have a few minutes for questions, so you can add those to the chat. I will try not to be distracted by those questions as they come in, but I will go to them at the appropriate time. Joining me for today's panel, we have three esteemed scholars. Dr. Karen Mundy is director at the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning and professor of comparative international and development education at the University of Toronto. Dr. Kelly Gallagher-McKay is assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Dr. Mohammed Elmi joining us from the Diversity Institute, and Dr. Elmi is director of research at the Diversity Institute. We're going to dig into the topic today, and we're going to begin with Dr. Elmi. Mohammed, I'm wondering, we don't want to talk necessarily about the fact of educational inequality. Dr. James has covered off and shared some of the thinking around that. But I would love to know, in your role as the Director of Research at Diversity Institute, how has your research uncovered maybe some of the challenges, the barriers we have at addressing those inequalities? Perhaps you could start us off with a reflection on that.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Dr. Carl James for an amazing introduction that lays the groundwork for some of the things that I'll be talking about in response to your answer. And thank you to the organizers as well for including me in this amazing discussion today. I want to just begin by first acknowledging that these are deep issues that cut across all aspects of society. We're talking about education, and this is something that the Diversity Institute has been examining for a very long time. Just for context, the Diversity Institute conducts multidisciplinary, can't say the word, multi-stakeholder research to address the needs of diverse Canadians and the changing nature of skills and competencies, the policies, processes, and tools that advance economic inclusion and success. As Dr. James alluded to, we have known some of these issues for a very long time and how to address them, and some of the solutions we've been attempting to find different pathways, different solutions to try to at least find ways in which to address some of these larger societal issues. It started a long time for us as an action-oriented research institute that aims to remove barriers. We started 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, as an institute that was founded by Dr. Wendy Sukia, one of the speakers coming up after, looking at diversity leads that has been looking at representation in senior leadership and boards across sectors where we notice an underrepresentation of racialized individuals, women. Last year in 2020, we released a study that looked at over 1,600 corporate board members, and we only found 13 board members who were Black. And so we noticed that this is a cross-cutting theme because we're talking about the pathways from high school, even earlier than that, to post-secondary education, to senior leadership, to boards. Another thing that we've been looking at is examining STEM education and the underrepresentation of women in science, technology, engineering, and math. And some programs we see that the number of women, for example, in computer science declining drastically. So using an ecological approach that tries to understand diversity and inclusion at the societal, organizational, individual levels, we're trying to leverage technological and social innovations to address those long-term and long-standing issues that are affecting society. And so by taking research and applying them to action-oriented programs like ADAPT, a program looking at skills development and work placement, it started off as social science and humanities students and graduates, but it expanded more to include a larger swath of society, looking at entrepreneurship training and providing supports for newcomers, or women entrepreneurs. So we understand that social mobility, as Dr. James spoke about so well earlier, is education is a strong predictor of social mobility in Canada. We understand that in this country, having one of the highest rates of social mobility, it has one of the highest social mobility rates in the world, but it still experiences inequalities where where generations might be impacted. And the data is explicit in showing that despite Canada's pride in its diversity, racialized youth are still facing barriers to finding equal chances to succeed. Racialized and marginalized students are already facing multiple barriers. So we found that when in the Black Experience Project, which I had the pleasure of assisting with, and Dr. James also was a part of, where we found, being Black presented challenges to about half of the Black students who felt that being Black presented challenges not faced by other students. We know that dropout rates for Black students in a study by Dr. James showed that streaming has an impact into the type of programming that they go into. Now, when we're looking at the impact of COVID itself, there's definitely an increased dependency on work. We understand that in our daily lives. Students themselves are having issues accessing the internet. So I feel like I'm rushing a little bit because there's so much research in this area. So we know that access is a function of not just the network infrastructure, but affordability of devices and the skills as well. So I'll pause there. I hope I addressed some of your questions, Stephen.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm curious to, when you look out onto the landscape and the various tools and programs that are being put in place as a response to some of what you're talking about, which ones do you find get you excited? Which ones really give you that sense of hope that we may be on to something here?
I'd be remiss not to talk about the Study Buddy tutoring program, because keeping focus on the topic at hand, tutoring in the time of COVID. This program started in May 2020 as a direct result of the pandemic. There was a need out there as the transition drastically impacted, the transition to online education drastically impacted some communities a lot more than others, as Dr. James mentioned in his opening remarks, that if there's a break in education, students from marginalized communities are more impacted. So this program came as a result of that in partnership with Ontario Tech University, the Jean Augustine Chair, and the Lifelong Leadership Institute. The program supports parents who need support with their educational support for their students, their young children. And it targeted specifically marginalized students. And my colleague will speak more about the numbers in a little bit in the second panel. And it found that participants who were recruited in because the participants needed the help, but teachers in training also needed the time to be able to gain work experience in a live setting, dealing with students one-on-one, and in an environment that would allow them to explore their teaching potential as well. So there's a need on the teachers and training side, and there's a need in the wider society, parents and students who needed the supports in various academic subject areas. And even in the summer, it continued with a Summer Up program through the Lifelong Leadership Institute that provided tutoring over the summer months as well. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. I'd love to circle back and make some connections between those programs. Wanted to go to Kelly Gallagher Mackay. Kelly, you've really dug into this, the tutoring aspect in particular, and you've just completed an evidence review focused on tutoring and its effectiveness, as well as tutoring initiatives that have been implemented in other jurisdictions in response to the pandemic. I wondered if we could get you to dig into the findings of that. Before we do, though, I wanted to know, as a researcher, what are some of the questions that you wanted to address in your particular review?
Well, sure. I'm a policy researcher, which means I'm interested in sort of two things, one of which is, where's the evidence that suggests something's going to make a difference if we're going to invest in education recovery for kids. And I think there's good evidence, and Mohammed's talked about some of it, that a significant number of students have been considerably left behind. We don't have a lot of Canadian data, but a survey of Canadian teachers, 70% of them say kids are going to be left behind by the educational disruption of this pandemic, and they're not going to recover without help. So it's urgent, and we should know, well, if we're going to do something, what would make the biggest difference? So that was one of the questions I was interested in. And then I'm interested in knowing what other countries are doing, because this is not a unique to Canada problem. So what can we learn from other places?
And what did you find? What can you share with us?
Well, broadly, the countries we usually compare ourselves with have invested far more, an order of magnitude more, in educational recovery for students, to make sure that the short-term disruption, and 2 years isn't that short, but the short-term disruption don't have lifelong impacts for those students. Second, tutoring really stands out in terms of the likelihood that as interventions go, it's going to make a difference for students. And I think there would be one other kind of context comment I'd have before I jump in, which is that we know that the pandemic has been really hard on teachers. Teachers have had to meet a lot of demands, extraordinary demands, very quick changing, and really meet very wide-ranging needs on the part of their students. And they've gotten almost no additional resources for doing it, which creates a bit of a cycle of burnout. So we're interested in thinking about what effectively supports teachers too. And when it comes to tutoring, the evidence is really impressive that it's cost-effective and high-impact way to address learning challenges associated with the pandemic, and that there are numerous international models of ways it could be scaled up quickly with appropriate investments. When we say tutoring, what do we mean? I think that's worth covering. Usually it's somewhere between 1-to-1 and up to 5 kids at a time. And that is different from and can only be supplemental to what classroom teachers do. As a classroom teacher, you have to plan, you have to deliver, you've got to assess, you've got a large group of people, things are all happening at the same time, and you're trying to set them up for life in a very wide-ranging way. Tutoring, you're focused on something quite small, 1 or 2 kids at a time, much easier to create that kind of mentoring connected relationship in the time you're spending together. And much easier to do fast feedback that makes a big difference for people's learning. And if tutors are working with teachers, they can often kind of backfill the essential information students need so that they can take advantage of the rest of the class. So tutoring has a kind of powerful supplementary model for learning. And the research is that it has a very high absolute value, and relative to other ways we could intervene with students, it's powerful. To do social policy planning, you have to compare apples to oranges, right? You can't just look at everything being the same. So one of the ways we do that most in social policy is through something called a meta-analysis, where you compare the relative effectiveness of different approaches. And there are a bunch of meta-analyses out there which tend to show that high-dose tutoring, that's like offered at least 3 times a week, has a consistent, substantial, and positive impact on academic achievement for all students, especially those facing disadvantages. And Phil Laurier is going to talk later today, and he actually is the lead author on one of the most important of these meta-analyses, which he did for the Nobel Prize winning Poverty Action Lab at MIT. When you take them together, there are some key things to learn. First of all, it's as effective as something as powerful as early childhood education. And it's significantly more effective than things like summer school and after school programs or curricular reforms in terms of helping close gaps and make students accelerate their learning. It can be delivered in a lot of different ways. There's many models out there, but there are common elements that make a difference. The strongest effects of tutoring are associated with teacher-delivered tutoring, but there are very, very strong effects with paraprofessional tutoring. And that can be either education assistants or full-time students, recent college grads working in schools, almost as effective, much cheaper. And there's not a shortage of those people in the same way that there's a shortage of teachers right now. Again, there's a big relationship between how often students receive tutoring and academic outcomes. So 3 times a week is almost twice as effective as just once a week or less. It's effective at all ages. Most of the evidence is around early learners, and that's a really important group when we think about the impact of the pandemic, because the biggest educational hit has been on the youngest learners. But there's very strong evidence for middle school and even high school students. For example, the SAGA tutoring program uses full-time college grads to work with disadvantaged students. And what they're showing is 2.5 years of gain in 1 year. Plus higher graduation and better school connectedness, big life outcomes. There aren't a lot of rigorous studies of community-based tutoring, and especially not those that link tutoring to broader social and health supports, which is a really important part of our ecosystem. But the evidence that exists says school-based programs tend to be twice as effective. And the last thing I'd say we pull out of the evidence is that the research that, again, and this mirrors what I just heard from Mohammed, that tutoring is really good for tutors. The impact of full-time service learning shows huge growth in tutors' academic and professional skills and improved trajectories. The short-term cost of tutoring it's expensive as educational interventions go, but we are starting to see some research on cost benefit. And like early childhood education, the return on investment is exceptionally strong, because we have to look at things like improved lifetime earnings, reduced social cost, and improved skill development, which, when, as Julia says, when we think about the very fast changing world we're living in, really matters. And we also know there's about a 4-to-1 cost benefit return associated with service learning programs generally, just on the tutor side, not even the student side. So, and I don't want to take too much longer, but I do want to remind you about tutoring being taken up by other countries. Compared to the UK or the US or Australia or the Netherlands, Canada's spending on educational recovery is off by an order of magnitude. We aren't doing enough for these kids. And tutoring in all those countries has been a key strategy that's been adopted. So in the UK, they're spending 1 billion of the 2.4 billion pound educational recovery fund on tutoring and school-based mentors. Their goal was to reach 20% of students who'd fallen furthest behind. And they've had a lot of adjustment required as they've rolled this program out, which they've been trying to do since September 2020. Schools have a lot of autonomy to make decisions about who needs tutoring and whether to work with national program or local organizations now. And they've got a centralized intake and training for all tutors. In the US, $25 billion was invested only on responding to learning impacts. There was another 100 million that went into, safe schools. States are in control of education the way provinces are here. So they had some autonomy about how they were going to spend those federal funds, but half of them opted for tutoring because of the research base. And they've just spent an additional $1 billion to expand their national service program. There is a lot more I could say, but I think I'll stop and give someone else a chance.
Well, that's there's a lot of questions that I have written down. Before going to Karen, I wanted to just suggest, as a longtime teacher myself, I always felt when parents came to me and said, well, my child is enrolled in a tutoring program, or we're thinking of a tutor, I always took that personally as a slight on my ability to reach that student, which could very well have been well placed. So I'm fascinated to explore more at some point that connection between the schools and when tutoring works best, in conjunction with the local school and the local program. I don't know if you have just a brief comment on that.
I think it's something different. I mean, I don't know why anyone would expect someone to learn the same way 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 as you learn 30-to-1. It's not a slight. There's very little work that's harder than being a good teacher. And that's partially because you have to meet the needs of 30 people at the same time, or 25. And so to think of it as a supplement and a complement, I think, is essential. It doesn't replace, but it can accelerate, and it can fill in gaps in a particularly responsive way that can allow the teacher to actually experience the success that when you read the literature, they're talking about students who are at like 7 to 9 years of difference in one classroom. If you can help supports the students who are the furthest behind to be able to be in the same conversation, that's good for everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I feel much better about that 30-year career. Karen Mundy, the cartographer in the room. This is exciting. So a lot of people have tackled the tutoring enterprise, I guess, or undertaking. You've gone out and you have actually mapped out some of what's happening in the Toronto area in terms of tutoring and that whole landscape. Why a map? Why is this an important undertaking for you?
Maybe we could just step back and talk a little bit about what motivated Kelly and I to get started on the mapping exercise, the evidence review, and of course, a very important toolkit that is to support tutoring organizations to better evaluate and monitor their own effectiveness. So here we could see a Canadian program to bring volunteers into public service learning fail. You'll all remember the Canada Youth Program. We could see our own children and children in neighborhoods nearby us suffering because of COVID. We started a program at the University of Toronto that you'll hear a little bit about later with the Toronto District School Board that partnered students from University of Toronto with kids to help them through tutoring. And then we started to get really interested in what else was going on. And we were committed to the idea of tutoring, partly because we had started to read this wide evidence base that Kelly has just told you about. So what did we do? We went out, through a snowball sampling and an online review, we found a group of tutoring organizations based in the community. So we weren't looking for for-profit tutoring organizations, but community services. We gathered 70 organizations and we surveyed those organizations. About half of them responded to us. And what we found was a great diversity in provision, important diversity, and actually a very rapid response among that community of service providers to the pandemic. They were often trying to scale up or change their model so that they could reach kids, underserved kids, online. Just to give you a highlighted idea of the diversity of these organizations, some were serving over 500 students, most were serving under 50. Among them, most were serving students in the field, in the disciplines of math and literacy. Most rely on volunteers, usually undergraduate students. Most were targeting their services to racialized and low-income communities. And most were facing some form of resource gap. That is, they needed more funding in order to scale their work. We also saw that there was a lot of room for improvement in the work that was being done by these organizations. Not only that we would have loved to see a larger scale of response than this collective group could provide. On the positive side, many of these organizations are offering tutoring throughout the school year or a semester. They are matching tutors with students consistently so that they can form a sort of social bond, a relationship that allows for effective learning. And they are working with parents and families by and large to reinforce students' learning. But we could also see that in contrast to some of the best practices that is revealed in existing evidence, few of these programs are really high dosage. Few of them are offering tutoring 3 times a week. Most of them are not using a structured curriculum, and they are not using a sort of an initial assessment of student skills as the basis upon which to tailor the tutoring to the student. And most are actually missing the link back to the school and to the teacher, which in a way is important if we really think of tutoring as supplemental to and tailored to the needs, supplemental to the classroom, but also tailored to meet the needs of students in achieving success within the school setting. And of course, many of the programs simply by the virtue of their size, they couldn't really afford to train their tutors in an ongoing way. And we know that this training is what allows those tutors to be effective. So overall, I think we concluded from this ecosystem map that there is a real opportunity to form a network or a coalition among existing community-based tutoring providers, that these organizations could be encouraged to work together to, for example, make common investments in training tutors, and also might play a stronger advocacy role by coming together to work for greater financing, greater funding for tutoring, greater acceptance of tutoring as an intervention that is of high impact and that really is needed to bridge some of these gaps in learning and equity gaps, as Carl James has told us, reminded us about for underserved students, especially in Toronto and in other urban centers in Canada.
Well, I love the idea of the map. It places things in a larger context. I'm wondering which stakeholder group might use the map to the best of its ability, I guess, or what stakeholder group might find this most interesting and helpful?
I think our thought was that teachers and schools might use it in order to get a map of services that are available in their community for kids that need this extra support. We also thought parents might be able to use the map, again, to access services. But I think more importantly, we hope to inform this community of practice or network to try to start building a bridge. You know, in some other social sectors, you have nonprofits acting coherently in an ensemble, really working together to try to get social policy to change. But this is not the case among tutoring organizations, which are often small and often really don't have the staffing and the resources to allow them to improve their own programming and scale. So I think, you know, we really thought of this primarily as supporting that community of practice.
Are there some directions or tools that other communities might be able to use to do a similar mapping exercise?
Well, I think we not only do we cover our own methodological approach, so people can take a look at the report and they can use our tools and instruments. We've also created a toolkit that is really primarily focused on helping tutoring organizations to improve learning about their impact and about whether their programs are improving the outcomes for kids. And we really very much welcome, you know, if any community partner wants to know more about how to do a mapping of this kind, we'd be certainly very happy to share our approach and our methodology and support that kind of work. If we had the resources, I think we would have been glad to do a mapping exercise across the whole of Canada, but really in a very short period during a pandemic, we were only able to cover Toronto as our sort of first point of departure. So far. Yeah. Well, thank you all for your comments. I would remind our audience that we are going to go to some audience questions. I'm just scanning the chat there. I don't see any yet, but if you wanted to, and it would help me with my eyesight if you put those questions in capital uppercase letters. It's not shouting, but that would help me a lot. I wanted to circle back to our panelists to maybe pick up on that idea of the benefits of tutoring, and we kind of skirted some of the, I think some of the important issues. We know that it's good in the short term for maybe short-term outcomes, but perhaps each of you could tackle that question: is what are some of the other benefits that might be hiding, waiting for us in that tutoring relationship? Kelly, I know that you're passionate about this. Could we begin with you?
Yeah, I'm going to try and take your question. And also I see in the chat a question from Robin Liu Hobson from People for Education about does tutoring just suggest something privatized? And I think it
okay.
is really notable that with the pandemic, there was an enormous increase in private tutoring. So it was one of the drivers of inequity in the pandemic, is that people who could afford it were able to pay to get extra help for their kids. The Toronto District School Board has done really fantastic research that shows that kids who are more disadvantaged more often feel that they need help and are less likely to get help. And that's why we really focused on the community-based tutoring system. I don't know if you want to give up the word tutoring. I think the idea that students get individualized support to help them keep learning and keep on top of what they need to learn for those lifelong skills, because I believe there is such a strong connection between students gaining skills and knowledge and their long-term well-being, that when we think about the priority on well-being in the pandemic, it has to be a priority on short and long term, and it has to include learning. I think we should expect that every kid can get some individualized support. And I do think that there is a public role in making sure that we aren't allowing out of control private tutoring to only serve the kids who can afford it rather than the kids who need the help the most. And I think there is a place for us to make sure that we're investing in the kind of responsive, individualized, respectful support. And when we think of the current crop of, say, college grads, if they were to be able to play this role within our public system, supporting kids through our public schools, it's a much more diverse group than the current teacher workforce. It would be a rapid injection of diversity and a really great investment in a pipeline to one of the most important careers of the future, which is teaching.
So Kelly, I'm going to follow up on your follow-up there. Vanessa has a question about other countries and the model of integrating tutoring within school hours. Did you find that in your research?
Yeah, that's happening a lot. And that's very common with the AmeriCorps model. So it'd be, students would be pulled out for 20 minutes to 50 minutes, depending on their age and attention span and stuff like that, a couple times a week by tutors who work with teachers to figure out and assess needs, teachers who are given planning time to allow that. There's a whole lot of different ways it's being done. And so in Australia, there's a lot of flexibility. They're using trained teachers or allowing schools to buy out their teachers so that they can do the one-on-one work.
Right.
Britain, totally happening within schools. It depends on the states and the states.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Mohammed, could I circle back to you on that question of maybe not hidden values, but maybe values that you have found about the tutoring relationship that the public might not?
Yes, I can add to that. I think one of the things I heard, I was in a panel and somebody mentioned that tutoring can be a powerful leveler. It can provide supports for those students who just need a little bit of extra support or maybe even a lot of extra support to get to a place where they can finish their basic education, basic K-12 education. I think we definitely have to find ways in which we try to get to marginalized and racialized students to ensure that they are receiving additional support. One of the things I didn't mention earlier was that the barriers that are present in terms of access to internet, and we have, going back to Dr. Gallagher-Mackay's comment earlier about education and tutoring not just being islands onto themselves and are connected, and the policy implications to the wider society has to be thought of. But once we start making those connections, I think the benefits of tutoring are immense, particularly, as I said, for those students who need that extra support to go into whatever trades, either tertiary education that they might want to go into.
Karen, do you have a response to that? And then we're going to go to a couple of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece that perhaps is the most surprising to me is how much good evidence there is on the impact of tutoring on the volunteers, the volunteer tutors. And this really is very important, right? We're creating a set of skills that are immediately transferable into the workforce and that build a kind of civicness into our society simply by empowering young people to help others. I would also say that, as Kelly has pointed out, and we saw this certainly at University of Toronto, we really were able to bring a much more diverse group of tutors than most of the students had ever experienced in their actual schools. So this is also a powerful way of bridging what we might say is a diversity gap in our teaching workforce. So very, very important. And then also just to mention, even though most of the evidence focuses, I think, primarily on learning outcomes that can be improved through tutoring, it was very obvious at an anecdotal level that most programs are reporting very strong improvements in sort of psychosocial development, in self-efficacy, in mental health. That is an outcome of these tutoring interventions. And often these are areas where teachers in a classroom really have trouble to reach the kids with the biggest need.
Thank you. Kevin Lee has a question. And Kevin, I'm going to read your question because it's long and there are probably a couple of questions in there. I just don't want to get it wrong. And it's in the chat. But how can we subsidize the cost of tutoring then? I personally run a homework tutoring program for newcomers once a week. And I also run a one-to-one support mentorship where youth can get support they need. But some of the volunteers come back to me to say that it is too demanding of them to volunteer their time. So my other question is that, do you think there's a correlation between the cost of tutoring versus the amount of support children get? So I'm going to leave those questions there. Kelly, Mohammed, Karen, anyone want to take that?
I might just say that, this really is the piece of the puzzle that we need national and provincial policymakers to grab hold of. So we know that in other countries, service learning programs or youth employment programs are being used in ways that allow organizations to offer broader and more widely scaled tutoring. We also know that other parts of the population are not being tapped for tutoring that might be. So think about all of those of us who are getting on in years and might want to do some volunteer-based work going forward. So I think we've got to imagine a world in which there's more funding for the tutors themselves, that these tutors will be paraprofessionals, and that we need resources. We need our central government and our provincial governments to grab hold of this opportunity sooner, not later.
And I wanted to circle back on a question that Dr. James raised at the end of his presentation. Though it's a similar question that we're asking about teaching. Who is doing the tutoring, and how do we encourage the people that I guess would be most powerful, most impactful in those relationships to take on the role? Mohammed, I'm not sure if you have a thought on that one.
The study buddy model are teachers in training who need practicum hours. And that model worked really well when schools went virtual, and teachers in training were in need of practicum hours. That model becomes a little bit difficult when summer months come and or the transition between cohorts coming in. So there is a little bit of issues there, but generally that model worked really, really well to connect volunteers essentially with students who need the support. And that's the study buddy model, and the next panel will talk more about it in a few minutes.
In the mapping study, we saw that there were really diverse models for recruiting volunteers or recruiting tutors. And I just want to highlight a couple of different models. Some programs in Ontario are using peer-to-peer tutoring. So teachers are coming in and training other students in the school to offer peer-to-peer programs that apparently, according to some evidence, have pretty good results. So another completely different model. We also saw several programs in Toronto where community-based organizations are recruiting students or young people from the immediate catchment area in underserved communities. So they're basically providing employment for local youth that are part of the communities in which the tutees live. And so that also seems like a powerful model. We don't have much evidence about its efficacy, but we do know from those organizations that they find it to be very powerful and very accepted by parents. In other words, parents really like it when the tutors come from their own community.
And I think there is good research that says it makes a difference for students if they have a tutor who has, like for Black students, if they have a Black tutor, having positive role models in their lives sooner and in educational leadership roles makes a big difference for students over time. And it is a real failing of our current system that we don't have enough racialized educators. And there's a lot of systemic barriers to overcome, but one of the issues is a pipeline issue. And it is a short-term way of ensuring that we see people in an education and a leadership role in our schools in the short term. And hopefully by having a good, if we were to do something like a service corps model where people are not, they're volunteers, but they're doing it full time for a year and they're getting a stipend. If it's that kind of a model, they're getting some formative work experience that helps qualify them to go on to Teachers College and become fully certified teachers to do that bigger, wider, harder job, and changes the pipeline dynamics a little bit, because that is something we need to work on when we think about the education system as a whole.
So there is a question and answer box in Zoom, I've just found out, and there is a question waiting there. And we'll make this a final real question. How can local organizations be supported to generate and disseminate local geographical knowledge and be active participants in the discourse? Not sure if that resonates with Karen, you're smiling, Sue. Well, you get first crack at that.
I think that I'm going to give you a bit of a flying by the seat of my pants answer, because while we worked so hard on the initial research with our colleagues at the Diversity Institute, we really then held forth the idea that we would start to develop a community of practice. But I think our first step now is to disseminate the research back to those organizations that participated in the study. And we really do hope that there will be a network that will form or be generated from this initial effort to try to map and understand the impacts of tutoring.
It really was striking that there isn't a list of the places that do community-based tutoring in Toronto, and that they get funding from all different levels of government, a complete mishmash of who's funding what. Like, there is definitely room to strengthen the network supporting these organizations, and the work they're doing is the demand for it far outstrips the supply. And again, we did try and develop this evaluation toolkit so that maybe people have some kind of common ways of talking about the outcomes of the work and understanding their own progress. But it's really one of these areas that has persistently it persistently exists. There's a lot of these programs, but they're small and they're disconnected. And so figuring out ways of hooking them up, supporting them better is, I think, a good priority.
Mohammed, final word to you, sir.
Thank you. The big weight on my shoulders now. But what I was going to say was, I think what we've done is show that there's these gaps, there's this need, and we have to find a way to try to offer these supports, because I think as the online education model continues and is adopted more widely, we have to find ways in which we don't leave anyone behind, whether it be on the infrastructure side, but more importantly on the educational supports directly for the students, so that they can succeed.
Thank you. Okay, Kelly, Mohammed, and Karen, thank you for starting us off this afternoon. A very interesting conversation. I heard the word policy a couple of times. I noticed that Charles Ungerleider's in the house, so I'm sure he has something to say about policy down the road, as others do. But thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for your thought-provoking questions. It's now my duty to move on to the second panel for today, Tutoring in Toronto, an interactive discussion with our community of practice. And Karen mentioned community of practice. So we're going to welcome our panelists, and I'm going to introduce your moderator for the next panel. Erin Smida is the project manager of the Study Buddy program at the Diversity Institute. We heard that referenced. Marcy Ponte is executive director at Working Women's Center. Nandini Saw is vice principal at Mark Garneau Collegiate Institute at the Toronto District School Board. And Sheldon Parks is program manager, Beyond 330 program, Toronto Foundation for Student Success. And leading the conversation for you this afternoon is Stephanie Day, who is director of research partnerships at the Diversity Institute. So Stephanie, I am going to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Very excited to be here today to facilitate this conversation. And I know that we have had some very interesting conversations so far, and we've got a few more lined up. So I'm going to jump right in with our first question to really understand a bit more about our esteemed panel today. And I'd like to begin by having each of our panelists introduce your experience and the tutoring initiative that you work with. So if we can please start with Erin.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Stephanie, and thank you to the panelists in the first section. There were some amazing points. My colleague, Dr. Elmi, has teed up some points that I'll be referring back to. But I'm Erin Smida. I've been a classroom teacher for 15 years, physics and chemistry, international experience. And in early 2020, I started working with Ryerson. And in May of 2020, Ryerson rolled out the Study Buddy program, which I am currently the project manager of. What we do is we facilitate online, free, one-on-one tutoring sessions by connecting Ontario teacher candidates to families to provide junior kindergarten to grade 12 tutoring support online to their children. As Mohammed in the previous panel discussed, we saw that there were factors that were more significantly hitting racialized students and newcomer families than others in as a response to COVID. And what we put together was we saw that teacher candidates, the next generation of teachers, were not able to enter their classrooms to receive their practicum hours. And we saw that these communities were particularly hard hit by COVID. So we put those two together and channeled the talent of these young soon-to-be teachers to provide this support. Since May of 2020, we've provided 492 students from 317 families with nearly 6,000 hours. As of this morning, it was 5,982 hours of tutoring support through 8,578 online tutoring sessions by connecting those families with 317 tutors from various partner universities. We're partnered or we have tutors that come in from 9 separate universities. What we found was, although, as Mohammed said previously, this was initially a sort of a mitigation of the teacher candidates not being able to get into classrooms, and this was a solution for that. We've found that even though students are going back to classrooms and teacher candidates are able to continue working in classrooms for their practical requirements, universities have found such important results in their teacher candidates that they've sent us, that they're continuing to send us teacher candidates to work under the study buddy model. We are receiving more and more tutors each cohort. We have 68 tutors who will be coming in January to join this program. And yeah, that's what Study Buddy does in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Aaron. No bias on my side, but I know Study Buddy is a great program. And Marcy, if you could please also share a bit about your experience as well.
Sure. So the Working Women Community Center is not a tutoring organization. We are a settlement agency working with immigrant women and their families. And we've been doing so since 1974. But in 1991, we responded to a report that the City of Toronto commissioned to look at ethno-racial inequality in the City of Toronto. And that report identified 5 gap communities where there were high dropout rates and low rates of students going on to post-secondary education. We were primarily a Portuguese and Spanish-speaking service organization at that point. We have now evolved to 25 languages, but the Portuguese community was top of the list. And so we took on the role of addressing this issue along with a couple of educators in the community. We developed a program that we call On Your Mark that has been working since 2000 to address the issue of education in our community. We've since evolved to the Latinx community. We work with children in grades 1 to grade 12. We partner with both boards of education who provide us a stipend bit of money, which is really helpful. But they also, outside of COVID, they provide program space Monday to Saturday for our program. We partner very closely with York University, the teacher candidate program, as well as U of T and a couple of community colleges, where they actually do recruiting for us on an annual basis. They promote our program, and that's where the bulk of our tutors come from. I get into the program a little more, but we during COVID, we had just over 230 students, 265 volunteers. Students came to us from over 88 schools across the City of Toronto, and we're starting up the program again with this, and the volume is increasing. We know that the need has been really great for these families where parents are working 2 or 3 jobs, or they don't have the skills to provide the tutoring that their children need. Our program is very much a family community development, takes a community development approach, and I can get into that more as we go on.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much, Marcy. And Nandini, if we could also hear a bit more about your experience in your tutoring program.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm currently a vice principal at Mark Garneau Collegiate. This is my 2nd year at Garneau. And I also served as a vice principal at Westview Centennial Secondary School. Previous to that, I was the coordinator for science and STEM at the board at the school board in a K-12 role. So I did understand from the beginning that learning, especially when it comes down to a pandemic scenario. When I joined here at Mark Garneau, I was new. I was a new vice principal when Dr. Mundy and her team approached us in understanding what are some of the academic gaps. Academic gaps were all definitely an issue, but my perspective as the vice principal that was in charge of the COVID portfolio, I was really the one that was in communication with Toronto Public Health on a daily basis. And Mark Arnault is a school in the Thorncliffe and Flemington area. We were definitely in the news during the pandemic. We were the first high school in Ontario to close 8 days before the December holidays. So in addition to, being an area that was highly hit by COVID, I was also new in the space. But from my previous experience, I understood the importance of the transdisciplinary learning and the extra supports that's necessary. And for myself as an educator to be that instructional leader. So Dr. Mundy and team did make it very easy for us. Because they were the ones that got the volunteers from the University of Toronto. My task was then to assemble teacher volunteers to help with the supervision. Dr. Mundy and I worked through from the partnership agreement with the Toronto District School Board to look at the day-to-day struggles, just in terms of, are we looking at Google Meets as opposed to Zoom? And how did that evolve in terms of the day-to-day operational pieces? So in the spring of 2021, we supported 16 weeks of one-on-one supports. That meant a Mark Arnault student with one U of T volunteer. And then in the fall, and it's still ongoing, we meet every Tuesday. We've had 11 weeks and counting. So in total, we've supported students, Mark Arnault students, for 27 weeks and counting. We have supported 86 students have been served, and a total of 53 volunteers have supported us. And when we looked at the data, Dr. Mundy and team, some of the key results I would actually be really happy to share with everyone today. All students felt positively connected with their volunteers. All supervisors strongly agreed that the program was valuable, and most students felt their confidence improved. So, we talked about the barriers, we talked about the impact and the stresses on our teachers in terms of the hybrid model. And especially last year when we're pivoting, when, we're an outbreak school and we're going back to in-person to remote learning. And then this year when we're doing a hybrid model, it has definitely taken a toll on our educators. And in that, the students did benefit, I feel, from the one-on-one, because sometimes when you're part of a larger group, we really do, the students might not have that one-on-one time, especially when you're trying to uphold COVID protocols and cohorts. And, this year, our teachers have 45 minutes lunch between classes. So, that's just a little bit about the program that I've supported, and it's ongoing.
That's amazing, Anthony. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'd like to also hear from Sheldon, please.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me take part in this important panel. So yeah, my name is Sheldon Parks. I'm program manager for Beyond 330. It's an after-school program run with the Toronto Foundation for Student Success. And essentially, we provide services for TDSB schools across the city. So for myself personally, we noticed last year doing our regular after-school program that there was a number of students that were struggling due to the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of that, and also parent feedback and a lot of input from principals, we noticed that if there was kind of an opportunity to add more supports. So one of our funders came forward and is able to provide additional funding directly aimed at tutoring. So in that standpoint, we're able to provide individual and in-person tutoring, but online individual tutoring, as well as some in-person tutoring opportunities to support the after-school program that we're currently working with. In terms of the tutoring overall, we were able to provide almost 10,000 hours of tutoring support to students. So we had a fairly wide reach, but it wasn't nearly as extensive as was needed based on the feedback we got from principals especially, but overall, we were able to see improvements with students in their tutoring, and I can speak more to that a bit moving forward. But essentially, we really had an opportunity because of the high need that we noticed within our schools and our communities.
That's really interesting. And I think across the board, we're hearing also a lot of bit about the impact, the number of people that were impacting, the hours. And the question I'd like to ask next is, how do you assess the impact of your project? So what evidence do you have of its effectiveness? I know Nandy shared a bit already about some of their metrics in terms of those qualitative questions that it seems went out, maybe perhaps in a survey format, in terms of satisfaction. It would be interesting to hear a bit more about the type of feedback and how we're measuring progress. Sheldon, you briefly spoke about the feedback you got. Maybe you just want to add on to that, and then we can also hear from some of the other panelists.
Yeah, so we didn't do any, we kind of had a lot of it anecdotal kind of responses from principals, as I mentioned, and parents. But we did do a general survey, a brief survey that we sent out to both tutors and parents. And obviously it was based on whoever responded, but we had over 90% response positive rate for, 90% responded that their children had a positive experience with tutoring, and also over 90%, I think 94%, that their child had a marked improvement in their academic achievement. So, I mean, that's something that we did see. The TDSB also does research with our program and our students. So they did some research last year that we're looking to hopefully get the results from this year, because typically with our after school program, we're able to, they track our students, and we're able to see the improvement of the students who take part in our program, and they compare it to the students that do not. So I'm hoping that we can see some positive responses from the students who additionally did individual tutoring as an addition to taking part in our after school program. Otherwise, yeah, mostly, like I said, it was just speaking with parents and just some general responses from the surveys, but that's kind of what we saw. And we also did some brief pre-assessments and post-assessments last year, but it was to a select number of students. So this year we're trying to kind of implement that program as well again this year, and kind of have a wider range of responses so we can really track and pin down what kind of improvements we're seeing and in what areas.
Yeah, that's great. And Marcy and Aaron, I wonder if you have similar metrics to measure success. And also, I wonder if there's anything on grades improving, academic performance improving. Marcy, did you want to jump in, and then Aaron?
We're a medium-sized organization. We run our program on a shoestring, just to put that out there. We don't have a whole lot of money, but we have a very robust program in that one of the things that we require is that parents connect with the tutors before and after the tutoring session, so that there's communication. And we hear, and we have a celebration at the end of the year. We hear relief from parents that we were able to provide the support for their children who otherwise would not have gotten through the school year, because the parents weren't equipped to help them. And so we know that anecdotally, we've impacted a lot of students, and the parents' relief, frankly, because their children would have been left behind had we not been there to provide the support and the tutoring for them. So we don't have the sophistication to have surveys and to do that kind of research, but we know anecdotally, as Sheldon has said, that we have made great impact. There's no Portuguese dropout rate anymore. We're dealing now with students from places like Goa, Brazil, Guinea-Bissau, and we're going through that same process, but we know that we're making a difference because we hear from parents that their children are sitting, reading their books. They're not sitting in front of the TV. They're engaged. They're wanting to learn. They wanted to keep up with their friends. And so, yeah, I mean, I think for us, that's what's working. Although we are now working with a professor at York University who is conducting a survey on our behalf.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that perspective, Marcy. And Aaron, how about what's happening at Study Buddy in terms of metrics? How are you measuring success?
Sure. We send out an REB approved survey at the end of each cohort to assess our participant engagement. We capture data on the parents' perspectives regarding the improvements that they've seen in their children, and as well as how Study Buddy is affecting their home lives. Our survey offers opportunities to provide long-form feedback as well as hard data. There's a couple of quotes that I have pulled up that I think really articulate what sort of the parents are feeling as a direct response of or direct result of Study Buddy. The experience for me and my husband was positive. I would not have been able to afford tutoring, and it eased the financial stress. It also lightened my workload as far as assisting with homework. This freed me up to get other things completed like cooking and cleaning. Thank you for this opportunity. Now, I think that it's really important not to overlook the home life effect that a program like Study Buddy or one-on-one online tutoring can have on the mental well-being of the entire household. Another quote, I have to say that because of this program, my daughter has developed a real love for math. She said that she feels like she's ahead, and seeing things twice has made all of the difference. She's getting straight A's, and I love seeing how happy this is making her. Her teacher said that she is not afraid to try now, and even when she is wrong, she takes feedback in a positive way. This is just a small representation of the hundreds of bits of anecdotal feedback that we're receiving in these surveys that's indicating a change in posture towards education, not only for the students, but also for the families. In terms of hard data, we're seeing that as a direct result of being a part of the Study Buddy program, parents are reporting that their children, 90% are more confident in schoolwork, 86% are less stressed about schoolwork, 94% are more comfortable with online learning. And one of the most encouraging bits of feedback regarding the students is 70% plus said that they are less anxious in general and in more control of life. And since I'm on a roll, the parents also report that 84% of parents said that they themselves, because of participation in this online tutoring program, have a reduction in anxiety, stress, and that as a direct result of Study Buddy, they feel more hopeful about the future. It's one of the last frontiers in addressing the student achievement gaps in schools is to provide resources and supports for the home environment so that families can create a positive posture towards education for their children. We are seeing academic improvements in the children, but even more encouragingly, we're seeing an improvement in the overall home life and posture towards education as an institution from these surveys that we're sending out at the end of each of our cohorts.
That's phenomenal, Aaron. Thanks so much for sharing those. And it's really interesting to hear how the students and the parents, their lives are really being transformed by the services that you're all offering. One of the findings in the evidence review discussed earlier is that in addition to the benefits to the learners, which we've really heard substantially about, tutoring programs can also have significant benefits for the tutors as well. What benefits have you seen among the tutors you work with? Nandini, perhaps maybe if there's anything here you could share with us, if there are any benefits for the tutors that you're seeing.
So when we were using the Google Meet, we didn't have an opportunity to gather as a larger group, but our second iteration, which is in the fall of 2021, we actually are using Zoom, and basically the volunteers from the University of Toronto and the Mark Garneau students are able to gather together. So we've actually created a community of learners, and we have at least 5 Mark Garneau teachers that are also part of that in terms of the helping with the supervision of the individual groups when the U of T student gets paired off with the Mark Garneau student. So it's a benefit for the Mark Garneau teachers because they are actually having an opportunity to be mentored. They're also having an opportunity to see a model of tutoring in terms of the logistical organization. If a student is absent and not at present, we have a system where we're going to call the students to remind them. And they need that gentle reminder, although we make phone calls the day before each session. So I've seen from the Mark Garneau teachers, they themselves now have started other opportunities to support students using very similar patterns. So instead of actually me sitting down with 5 of the teachers in my school, I now have 5 teachers that have been are still part of this program that are now branching off and doing other one-on-one support for students. So that's been the benefit for our Mark Garneau teachers. For the benefits of the University of Toronto volunteers, it's because they also have an opportunity, if a student is absent for whatever reason, we invite them to the common Zoom link. And in there, they are able to ask some of the volunteers from the Mark Garneau teachers have been teaching for 10 years, 15 plus years. Some just got the contract. So the University of Toronto students are able to ask questions, some logistical things. How do I apply to the school board? So they themselves are not just waiting for the students to join. And if the student is absent, it's still a worthwhile opportunity for the U of T volunteers. It also gives them an opportunity to see what's happening and having conversations about what are the day-to-day operational pieces of the school. So that formulates the conversation between the U of T volunteers and also the Mark Garneau teachers. And they are able to speak candidly about some of the current issues in education. So it's authentic, it's real. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Nandini. Thank you for that. Marcy and Sheldon, do you have similar experiences in terms of benefits for the tutors?
Sure. Our tutors are, for many of them, they're teacher candidates. Our students are their first exposure to working with racialized and ethnic communities. Because we have a relationship with the parents directly between the tutors, it's an opportunity. They learn to communicate with parents on a regular basis. Our coordinators connect with the tutors regularly to do check-ins to make sure that they're okay. To check in on supports that they may need. We've been doing this going into our 21st year. We have tutors who've been with us for 12 years. We have tutors who've been with the same student for 5, 6, how many years? 10 of our tutors are people who were graduates of our program, who came to us as students, who evolved over the years and went on to university and have come back as volunteers. And so we really promote that because they become not just tutors, but they're mentors. Their students can see themselves in these graduates and these mentors. So yes, we see quite a bit.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Sheldon, is there anything you wanted to add here?
Yeah, so kind of like Marcy and Nandini had mentioned, we did see a benefit with our tutors. Some of them are teacher candidates or teachers currently, some of them are not. So there's a wide range of experience among the tutors that we do have. But I think one of the key things we noticed is that getting that one-on-one individual tutoring support time gave our staff a chance to understand their student better and kind of the challenges they're dealing with, specifically when we're thinking about, engaging students academically during the pandemic, which I know is stressful and problematic for students on multiple fronts. Aaron talked about some of the mental health kind of aspects around that as well. So I think for our staff, I think they were able to gain confidence and a better understanding of their students and how to engage them. And that kind of helped inform the way they kind of came back to the tutoring sessions, which improved the work they had with the students individually, but kind of in a wider sense, we were able to see that in our after-school program. Our general after-school program engages students in academics, recreational, personal health and wellness. And the academic piece was difficult last year with continual shutdowns, the school opening, being closed, COVID outbreaks at school. So the students were going between in-person and online. And I think they were struggling in school day and they're also struggling after school. So our tutors being able to get that kind of individual time in a different kind of format and context than they would during the program, when they're working with many students in a more general group sort of format, they're able to key in on some of, as I mentioned earlier, the specific kind of qualities or needs that the students needed individually, and it kind of informed how they could improve the program and what they had to offer the program, because many of the staff who were tutoring were also in-person staff for our programs or online when we went online. So I think there was a huge benefit there because they were actually able to improve the academic portion of the program during our after-school program based on what they had been able to gain through their individual tutoring sessions. So I think that was one of the key things that we saw, along with the overall just growth in their personal ability to relate to and work with students in this kind of challenging context.
Very, very insightful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sheldon. At this time, I'd also like to invite those who are joining us online to ask questions via the Q&A function or in the chat box. I believe the chat box is also open if you have any questions for our panelists today. We can also take those up. And while you're thinking up your questions, just wanted to continue with a few questions for our panelists. We spoke briefly about some of the pandemic challenges. I've got two questions here that I'm going to combine just because of time, so feel free to jump on any of the themes here in the questions. The first question is, what unique frontline perspectives on pandemic challenges can you share? And how did you see tutoring make a difference in your community? We have heard a bit about the impact. We've heard about first teaching experiences, which obviously would be very memorable in a pandemic situation going virtual. And then the next question is the ecosystem mapping project discussed earlier did show that in Toronto, there are many tutoring initiatives, but they are very fragmented. So what opportunities are there to increase access to tutoring, especially for equity deserving groups? I know, Marcy, you've spoke about the community that you do serve. I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more about how tutoring is supporting equity serving groups and if there are some opportunities there. So maybe we'll start with Marcy, and then if anybody else wanted to chime in on any of those two questions mentioned. Marcy?
Well, the first challenge we had with the pandemic was technology. But because we were so defined with our two communities, we were able to secure donations to help the families with accessing computers, laptops, internet, you name it. In terms of the fragmentation, we have actually been working very closely over the last few months with the Ministry of Education to look at opening up our program, because we believe we've established a transferable model that is available to any community of need. And so, yeah, I mean, the Portuguese community is sort of dwindled as a need community in this exercise. But, we're continuing to open up our program and to make it available to students who need support. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did, Marcy, thank you. And I thought maybe Aaron may also wanted to come in here, and especially on the pandemic challenges and the equity serving groups. Aaron?
Sure, I'd also like to take an opportunity to answer your previous question about the effect on tutors. As a classroom teacher myself and the acting practicum supervisor for all of the tutors that come through our program, I'm reviewing and auditing and commenting, providing reports on every session. So each session that the tutors prepare, they engage in, they prepare a report. And so I have very close touch point to how these teacher candidates are being affected. And although 42% of our tutors do themselves identify as racialized or newcomers to Canada, many don't have firsthand experience with diverse environments. And being invited into their students' homes virtually is impacting them and their perceptions on what it's like to be from or live in these communities. Our tutors are reporting that they are empathizing with the struggles that their students face. When you're in a classroom teaching 30 plus students, or maybe close to 100 across all of your classes, which is what these teacher candidates would be experiencing if they were in a traditional practicum placement. You're building assessments, you're struggling with classroom management. It can be really difficult to connect with your students on a personal level, and even harder to connect with their families. And it becomes really easy to think that your physics test or whatever it is should be the most important thing in their lives. Our tutors are getting that one-on-one connection, not only with students, but more importantly with families. They're reporting that this empathy and connection is something that they're going to be bringing into their future classrooms. And our tutors today are the teachers of tomorrow, impacting potentially thousands of children's lives over decades. In response to the fragmentation question, StudyBuddy being fully online transcends geographic barriers, and being free to users, it transcends economic barriers. These are non-issues. The biggest issue that StudyBuddy is facing is funding. There's no shortage of demand for the services that we offer. Free, high quality, online one-on-one tutoring support provided by enthusiastic, young, soon-to-be teachers is very attractive. Similarly, faculties of education are seeing the benefits of this program in their teacher candidates and continue to increase the number of tutors they're sending us. Even with the opportunity for those teacher candidates to go into the classroom, they are choosing to send them to Study Buddy, either as their practicum requirements or as alternative placements. And in theory, we have no limitation to who we can support, to how many students we can support. Our only limitation to growth is the capacity of our very small team. And funding would allow us to improve the efficiency of our back-end processes and hire more support. This program is yielding incredible results, highly encouraging results, and it's really changing lives, as we're seeing in our hard data from our REB approved post-cohort studies. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. Thanks so much, Aaron. I noticed that we're coming up short on time. This has been a really good conversation, but I see 2 questions that came in through the chat box. One was, what training is provided to the tutors? What training are they provided? I know many spoke that many of the tutors are already teacher candidates, so I think there's that element there. And another question that we also had, though, which I would perhaps pose as a final word to Nandini or Sheldon or anyone who feels they want to jump at this question in this short minute we've got left. Can the panelists talk to the impact of mentoring and role models for students that have resulted from the tutoring program? So focus here on mentoring and role models as a result of the tutoring. Did anybody want to respond to this in our last 60 seconds of our panel?
I can jump in.
Nandini, great.
Yeah, definitely, because the pandemic has posed that in the past, the tutoring at Mark Arnault would be face-to-face. So the students then, I think, and the volunteers have learned the resiliency of learning to have to maneuver the online platform. So I even think after the pandemic is over, it's going to be an opportunity for the U of T volunteers to get across the city to Mark Arnault. Some of them live in different areas. We might have a blended model where a virtual might be an option. It might not be always one-to-one. Our students, they at first, when we talk about equity and anti-oppression, I think all of us had to look at our own bias. So at first we were thinking, well, why are the students not turning on their microphones or their cameras, right? And we also learned really quickly that it is also because it might be noisy in their environment. And so it's okay for us to be using a chat function. So really that's like DI in action. So when we're looking at the impact in terms of building the relationship, the positive impact is that we were not using our bias or misconceptions of who is on the other side of that. And learning the resiliency and learning to get to know each other in a non-traditional format. So it doesn't always have to be face-to-face, one-on-one conversations, because our volunteers and our students actually just see a name on the screen, and that's part of the agreement. But the students in their feedback and written conversations and turning on their mics or putting in the chat, lots of thank you, lots of one-on-one thank yous and comments to the U of T volunteers. And we know that because as you go around to the different Zoom groups, you can hear the dialogue increasing with time, and the trust factor is increased. And also attendance, whether that Mark Arnault student attends every week or not. That is testimonial to the impact and if it's worth their time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Nandini, thank you so much for bringing that insight to the discussion today. This really has been a very enlightening conversation. We are sadly at the end of our panel today. We heard some really interesting key themes, and especially in terms of the impact that we're having, not just for the students, but also for for the tutors, but importantly for the students, we're seeing them being more confident, more comfortable, and also the impact on the family. You know, even parents being less stressed and notably satisfied with these tutoring programs that are out there. So a huge thanks to our panelists for sharing that and for doing this very important work, especially as the pandemic has been so challenging. So a big thanks to our panelists for joining. Thank you again for sharing your insights. And now I'm very excited to introduce our final panel discussion today, tutoring and public policy. What might the role of tutoring be in the pandemic recovery? Please welcome our moderator, Dr. Wendy Sukier, founder of the Diversity Institute and academic research lead of the Future Skills Center, as well as our esteemed speakers, Dr. Philip Oriopoulos, professor of economics at the University of Toronto, Dr. Beverly Jean Daniel, assistant professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Ryerson University, Charles Unger Leader, professor emeritus, Department of Educational Studies in the Faculty of Education at U of BC, and Linda Massey, associate director of Principal Association Projects from the Ontario Principals Council. Welcome everyone, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And it really is a pleasure to be here. This has been a labor of love for many of us for quite some time. So I just wanted to open up with a few remarks. At the Future Skills Center, we've been working in this area since May 2020. Partly in response to the recognition that, you know, just building on what Dr. James spoke about, that the disruption that COVID had caused was affecting some groups far more than others. And we saw that in terms of employment, we saw that in terms of entrepreneurs, and we certainly saw it in terms of students. So there was a very clear recognition that if we didn't invest upstream, we were going to have problems downstream when it came to addressing the skills gap between job seekers and employers. So there was a very instrumental, practical reason for looking at this. But I think the other dimension was parents and dealing, especially with racialized Black and immigrant families, and seeing the struggles that many parents were having, whether they were self-employed and entrepreneurs, because we run the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, or whether it was simply working people trying to juggle their families and their jobs. And certainly even in the Diversity Institute, where we have 100 full-time staff, we lived on a daily basis watching parents with children trying to work through issues of work and children and so on. So I was really pleased that Aaron really stressed the issues around families, because I think increasingly we're starting to recognize that we need to think about families as units when we're trying to address a lot of these issues. The third thing that really came to light at that time was the need for work integrated learning, and the fact that the federal government had invested heavily in the student workplace programs even before the pandemic. But there were real challenges in getting placements. And again, that raised the issues around tutors and student teachers at different universities not being able to get placements. But most fundamentally, of course, our focus was on youth. And you know, it's been a number of years since Carl and I and Mohammed and others worked on the Black Experience Project and saw in very great detail the differences in the experiences, particularly of Black students in the GTA versus others, and the ways in which that was impacting their educational outcomes, and the recognition that COVID made everything worse. So any kind of inequality, whether it's based on gender, whether it's based on persons with disabilities, whether it's based on newcomers, Indigenous peoples, or even the LGBTQ2S+ community. All of the inequalities that previously existed for young people were made worse by COVID. And so I think, there was lots of research threads that were coming together to really highlight this, but it was actually one conversation that launched both this project as well as Study Buddy and a number of initiatives looking at skills gaps and how we need to start further upstream. And that was a conversation with Trevor Massey, who leads something called the Lifelong Leadership Institute, which is focused on creating opportunities for high potential Black youth in Toronto, and both Carl and I are on the board, as well as Linda. And I talked to him about tutoring because that had been such an important factor in my own daughter's success. And it wasn't because she was taught French or math. It was because she was encouraged, she was supported, and she had someone that was holding her accountable for what she was doing on a one-on-one basis. And I remember talking to Trevor about the role of tutoring and him saying, tutoring's really important, but it's for rich folks. And that was really the thing that gave rise to what was essentially an action research project, Study Buddy, and then a number of other initiatives that surrounded it, including this project, which we have funded, because it was very clear that tutoring is something that many of us who are privileged and have the resources to access have used in order to create opportunities for our children, but that it, like so many other things, was unequally available. And I think that we've heard a lot about why tutoring is important. We've heard a lot, thanks to the research that Kelly and Karen have done on international trends and how other countries are prioritizing this in various ways. We've also heard from them about issues around fragmentation and different models and unequal access. And we've certainly heard about the ways in which it intersects with broader social and political objectives around economic development, social inclusion, and all sorts of other things. And I would also argue it actually ties into policy discussions around access to internet infrastructure, because with respect to my colleagues, the internet is not universally available. There are huge differences between rural and urban access. If you're more reliant on digital networks, you're actually often increasing inequality. And I'm not sure if Mohammed mentioned it or not, but research we've done with the Environics Institute showed that 42% of racialized youth in Toronto are doing their homework on smartphones because they do not have internet access in one of the largest, most prosperous cities in the country. So there are a number of different threads, I would argue, to the policy discussions around this this initiative and the different variations of our strategies to try to invest in the success of young people. So the purpose of this particular session is really to try to figure out what are some of the common threads or themes that we should be pulling in order to address policy, whether it's at the school board level, whether it's at the provincial level, whether it's at the national level. Where does this fit? And what should we be thinking about? And Stephanie introduced our panel very briefly, but I'd like to talk provide a little bit more background. I'll start with Philip Oreopoulos, and Philip has done seminal work, not just in this area, but I know his work from the studies many of you have heard about that compared the outcomes, for example, of people with foreign sounding last names applying for jobs, and the fact that they were far less likely to get callbacks for interviews, even if they were Canadian born, Canadian educated, and so on. So quite apart from his work in this domain, Phil has a very impressive track record as a professor of economics and public policy. He's also a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he's a research fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. His current work focuses on education policy, and particularly how behavioral economics applies. So really, really pleased to have him here with us today. We also have Charles Ungerleider. Thank you. Who is a professor emeritus of the Departmental Educational Studies at the Faculty of Education, and he is also the Director of Research and a managing partner of Directions, Evidence, and the Policy Research Group. He has written on a wide range of topics related to education, from assessments to xenophobia. And he's the author of Failing Our Kids, How We're Ruining Our Public Schools, a critical examination of the state of public schooling in Canada. He also has a blog called On Education Canada and lots of publications. He also is someone who has looked very carefully at the issues around the impact of educational inequity on social cohesion, and some of the issues that we face in trying to scale tutoring programs is what he's interested in. We also have with us Linda Massey, who represents yet another constituency that we've heard from, but we haven't talked about a lot, and that's the principals. And Linda is an associate director of the principal, the Ontario Principals Council, where she's the associate director of Principal Association Projects. And she's also a board member of and co-founder of the Lifelong Leadership Institute. So she has experience both as a principal and longtime educational administrator, and is interested in how tutoring initiatives can work within the system. And last but not least is my colleague, Beverly Jean Daniel, who's done some really, in my view, groundbreaking work, perhaps not as well known as the work of others on the panel. But she has been actively engaged in issues around student success. So she's an associate professor with a PhD in sociology and equity studies in education. And her research publications and community work really focus on success for Black students and community members. She's been very active in addressing issues around anti-Black racism and on developing practical and effective supports to ensure the success of Black students at multiple levels. So she brings a really important perspective, I think, as well. So welcome all. And maybe I'll start with, we'll just go around the table and maybe you can each quickly give us some opening remarks in terms of the policy issues that you think that we should be looking at, where we need to go from here, because there's been lots of ground laid today, and we want to make sure that we translate the words into actions. So Maybe I'll start with you, Beverly. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you do and your perspective on these issues?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. My work, in some ways, really looks at one, supporting all of the pieces that happen to get our kids into the post-secondary sector. But I then step in to think about how do we ensure that once we get them there, they're able to complete their education so that they're then are able to access more viable careers. So I think there are multiple aspects of the work that needs to be looked at simultaneously. When we begin to look at the policies, I think what tends to be missing is that there's very limited policies that look specifically at the experiences and the needs of Black students within the post-secondary educational context. We often talk about K-12, often failing to recognize that by supporting the development of those who are already in the post-secondary context, the return on investment is much quicker. And that return on investment can also significantly enhance outcomes for the families and the communities from which many of our Black students are emerging. So that's, really where I engage in these dialogues more comprehensively.
Well, and I think it's very important building on, we've heard a lot about Carl's research on success factors in K-12 and the fact that many Black students, I think it was 90%, would like to go to post-secondary. Only 50% think they can, and they're about half as likely to get there. So once they get there, we have to be sure that we support them as well. And I think a lot of the factors that come up in the K-12 experience carry through to post-secondary, but as you said, Beverly, don't get nearly the same attention. How about you, Philip? Do you want to give us your sort of quick orientation to this issue?
Sure, thanks, Wendy. And it's been a great pleasure to listen on the conversations. I think that the discussion has been really fruitful. I guess from my perspective, as Kelly mentioned, I had done this help do this meta-analysis on tutoring. And I think the encouraging news is that if tutoring happens, chances are it can be quite beneficial. There's just a lot of consistent evidence that one-on-one or one-on-three tutoring can generate quite meaningful improvement in academic performance. The issue, I guess, to me, from a policy perspective, is that word if the tutoring happens, because if we want to think about tutoring at scale, it gets a lot more complicated. If you just leave tutoring to sort of those who volunteer for it after school or those who stumble on a program, then chances are we're not going to have the kind of at-scale impact that we're really interested in. For me, the most promising opportunity is within the school setting, trying to think about how to work with schools to embed tutoring as part of the regular curriculum stands the most promise of trying to reach the most students. On the other hand, it is expensive, and I think we have to recognize that even from a voluntary approach, setting it up, finding the tutors, coordinating it, making the time can be difficult. It was mentioned before that there are a lot of countries stepping up to the plate, finding additional resources to support that. And I think the first order thing would be to explore that possibility of whether policymakers and schools can coordinate to produce the resources needed to introduce tutoring at scale, ideally within the school time setting. But there are ways to think about affordability. One-on-three tutoring seems to work as well as one-on-one, although trying to look at that seems to be more challenging. The volunteer tutoring programs and the virtual programs that School Buddy is looking at also seem to offer ways to reduce costs. Another thing that others including myself, are looking at is to leverage technology to try to lower the cost of tutoring. So computer-assisted technology, as an example, tries to simulate the tutoring experience by allowing students to receive instruction and go through practice problems, receiving immediate help, and proceed incrementally at their own pace. What it's lacking is that person to look over your shoulder and to see how you're doing. So I think that there's room to explore ways to leverage computer tech assisted learning like Khan Academy, for example, together with teachers or tutors themselves as a way to substantially lower costs. We know less about that than we do on tutoring, but I think there's potentially a room it can play in trying to figure out how to provide personalized learning to a large number of people at scale. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We just completed a study with Deloitte looking at different learning platforms, adaptive learning, where they fit, where they don't, and especially when you're looking at skills-based tutoring, there is evidence that some AI-enabled applications can actually do a better job than people can under some circumstances. It's a question of what the focus of tutoring is and what you're trying to accomplish, I think. How about you, Charles?
Hi, Wendy, thanks. I'm a sociologist, but I'm going to channel my inner economist a little bit in a minute to this, because I'm with Philip on this. But let me back up and say, very early in my career, I developed material for cross-age in-school tutoring programs. Yes, they did have schools when I was younger. Let me be I'm kind of the policy guy, and I'm going to be the wet blanket. Some of you know I've been a deputy minister. And I'll come to tutoring in a minute, but one of the problems that we have more generally in education is that we often leap to our preferred solution to a problem. And I get the problem associated with COVID. I'm not sure it's the most pressing problem. I'll just give you two others about which I am very concerned from an equity standpoint. One is the students missing from school, and the number of those students is substantial. Number one, and that's a huge equity issue because those students tend to be racialized, tend to be indigenous, tend to be students with greater challenges, et cetera. So that's one. The second is a massive problem that's with us all of the time in schooling, and that's chronic absenteeism. As I say to students in my policy class, what's the universe of alternatives from which you pick that particular alternative and why? Like Philip, I am concerned about the massive cost of tutoring, especially if it is outside of the school context. In British Columbia, we have about 50,000 kids per grade, grades 1 through 3, to provide them with the kind of tutoring support that one would need. As it's been described, you need something in the magnitude, this back of envelope, about $300 million a year. A lot of money. If you did this Canada-wide, there are about 5 million kids in Canada, school-age kids. And if you did it for every kid, not just 1 to 3, you'd be talking about $3 billion a year recurrent. So that's a problem. What are the issues associated with tutoring that I am concerned about? I, like my colleague Carl James and others, I'm concerned about equity of access to tutoring. I am concerned about equity of outcomes for tutoring. I am concerned about quality assurance, and I am concerned, obviously, about providing and allocating resources. And there are some details associated with each of the concerns that I have that I'd be happy to talk about.
Great, thank you so much. Linda, how about you?
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to the Diversity Institute for hosting this discussion, because for me, the recording, and I believe I saw a note about a transcript that was happening as well, is going to be extremely valuable. And your summary, Wendy, of kind of the key points was really useful. I'm a Post-it note person, and I've been sitting here writing Post-it notes as we're going through. But I'm also involved in the process, working with Ontario Principals Council on part-time, because I'm a retired school leader and teacher. But I work on projects that we work on going to scale with principal associations and working with our principals in terms of their leadership skills. And quite a few of our projects are funded through the Ministry of Education. So when I think about policy, I think about what is the starting point for getting access at a larger level across the system. Where can we get support? I really appreciate the whole issue of, how much money would it cost to do some of this? But in terms of what Philip said, there are ways in which we can approach it. And I see a number of organizations that start here, around a hub around tutoring hub, and involve different partners, just like what happened with the Diversity Institute and Study Buddy, with several different community organizations taking advantage of the tutoring opportunities. And then bringing in, whether those organizations are the principal associations, whether it's the teachers federations, whether it's the directors of education, whether it's universities, colleges, there are different kind of ways in which to leverage the partnership, the community organizations like People for Education, those organizations of parents who have been very active during COVID in some school areas and some schools and whatnot. There are a lot of partners to pull together this kind of organization in terms of funding. Yes, I think it's a huge challenge. However, I still think it's a challenge that I feel inspired, to contribute to, just from what I'm hearing here and what our students in the Leadership by Design project, our Black students, have experienced through being supported in the Study Buddy program.
Well, thanks for raising that. And it's not an advertisement for Study Buddy by any means, but the federal government student workplace placement program, for example, which was a number of organizations are currently involved in, is actually a massive investment in providing training opportunities for young people. And that was where, to Erin's point about providing opportunities for student teachers, providing service learning, which Kelly and Karen talked about, providing placements and work integrated learning opportunities for post-secondary institutions or post-secondary students. That's a huge commitment of government as well. And so I like the fact, Linda, that you're thinking about how we can think outside of the box and not just view this as the responsibility of ministries of education, but we can think about this from multiple perspectives and try to bring resources together in order to provide more access, because as Charles says, it is such a massive investment that would be required to provide this at scale if we relied on traditional methods. But I think Philip has also raised some interesting prospects, and it's worth noting that one of the Canada's, I think they're a unicorn, I think they hit $1 billion investment, is actually a tutoring company using AI based methods in order to provide students with more access. So I wonder, I guess, Philip, of the group, you have some clear ideas in your mind about the value of this, but also how we would make it more accessible to the students who need it most. I wonder if you would like to elaborate a little bit on that and how it can contribute to economic recovery, but in my mind also economic recovery more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. So on Charles' point that there may be some other issues that we want to focus on, I do want to iterate that I think that COVID has led to higher variance in student ability within the same class, making it even more difficult for teachers to kind of help everyone. And I think there's higher risk of falling through the cracks. And I think where tutoring is exciting, like just to reiterate, and that, to get students back on track and, at least for the core subjects like math and reading, in a way so that they have the foundation that provides them the opportunity to keep going, is really important. And I think it is worth investing in. So even if it is expensive, there's encouraging models to say there are big gains as well. And so it still may be worth it with the cost. That said, the logistics of setting it up, are complicated. The Saga model is an interesting one where just space is allocated or time is allocated in the school year, week to spend, half an hour or even an hour a day on getting that extra help. I think a triage model, has the potential, for example, of having a classroom of students use something like computer-assisted learning to progress incrementally at their own pace, while using the data from it to identify the students who need the more personalized individual learning approach. I think there are different versions that we can research and explore that might be cost effective. And I guess one last mention is that possibility of having a large pool of interested volunteers, or fostering a culture of service from a pool of post-secondary students or just upper year students, seems to have a lot of potential. That there's a win-win out there if there could be more awareness of this possibility and desire for it. It might it might generate some momentum to find more people wanting to do this.
Yeah, and I think the word triage is really important, because it's sort of depends on whether you believe in universal access to everything, regardless of ability to pay, or whether, because that's the way you get broad support, is you give it to everybody, or whether you want more of an each according to their ability, each according to their need kind of model, where you do differentiate between, like, my kid who I can afford to support versus others who have more challenges and more needs. So trying to think through what the policy implications of that would be might be one way to address Charles's concerns about the costs of kind of a uniform and universal approach. But Charles, I wonder, recognizing this is not what you think is the top priority, can you see any way out of how something could be designed to improve access, to address your quality issues, and to help leave fewer people behind?
I can, and I can do it. I mentioned at the outset cross-age tutoring, where older kids teach younger kids. There is a benefit for both groups. It can be done on a whole class basis, so you don't have to leave some youngsters out. I'm also concerned, although I'm a policy guy, I'm concerned about the practicality of implementing any solution in a classroom. So that's something that can be implemented. Training can occur for professional staff in how for them to prepare the tutors to work with the tutees. They can provide oversight, etc. There will be an opportunity cost to that. I think this is Philip's territory, but there will be an opportunity cost because something that we think is valuable in schooling would have to be left out if we were to include this. But I think that is actually a very practical way to go about it, and it addresses some of my concerns about equity of access. It doesn't completely address the equity of outcome, but Philip makes a very good point about the variance within schools being greater than the variance between schools. We ought to pay attention to that and kind of try to narrow that down. It sort of addresses the quality assurance issue, and it certainly addresses the resource issue. It will be expensive, but primarily in terms of opportunity cost.
Interesting. And Beverly, how about you? I mean, I think you have experience with tri-mentoring and peer mentoring and other things, maybe more at post-secondary, but can you see how some of those models might fit in here?
Absolutely, because if we think about the fact that many of the post-secondary students have come through the very said schools where some of our students are currently having challenges. One of the things that the students have talked about is the importance of going back or giving back to the schools, right? So there are ways in which we can develop programs that allow for students who are at the post-secondary level, perhaps as part of their internship, depending on the programs that they're in, wherein which part of that could involve providing tutoring. But I think there's a piece of the dialogue that hasn't been brought up, even if we're talking about it from the construct of policy, and that's the ways in which race and racism really still does impact the nature of the conversations around even tutoring and mentorship. So we know, for example, or I should say based on the research that I've been doing, racialized students in the initial stages of their development, they prefer to have same race tutors, right? Because of the broader stereotypical implications that are imposed upon particularly Black students. However, what the research is also showing is that once they have gotten to a place where they're more comfortable in terms of their skill set and their racial identity, they function quite well with tutors who are qualified. There's not necessarily that push for same race tutoring. The other piece as well is how might we be able to support the development of the students in terms of their ability to access more mainstream options and activities, because even when we do have those activities that are streamlined or targeted to specific groups, as has been indicated by a number of folks, it's typically underfunded, it's typically sort of ad hoc, and what we find is that even though the intention behind it may sound good, the way in which it rolls out in terms of many of these communities tends not to sort of maximize the potential of the programs. So I think we do have to look at the ways in which sort of broader stereotypical notions of Black student capacity also impacts on what people assume that Black students need. Right. And if I can sort of really quickly add, I'm currently doing a project that's looking at the experiences of high achieving Black students in an attempt to determine what are the best practices that we're seeing there and how might we be able to embed those practices amongst other students in grades 7 to 12 so that we're addressing the gaps in middle school and secondary school. But on the other end of my work, also then looking at how are we supporting degree completion? How are we then moving students from undergraduate degrees into master's and other graduate programs to ensure that we're also preparing them for advanced leadership positions in various fields of work?
Yeah, I think that notion that we have to consider pipelines all the way through is is super important. And it's worth, you know, one of the things that it's worth noting, I was really pleased to hear Marie speak about the Portuguese community, because one of the things a lot of people are not aware of is Portuguese students actually have high school graduation outcomes that are not that different from Black students. The big difference is they have better employment outcomes. So people don't seem to be paying as much attention, but I'm working with a number of Portuguese community groups on very similar issues. And it is this idea that you have to start upstream, but you also have to engage the families, because the family engagement has a huge impact on shaping expectations and supports and stuff. And I see, Linda, you're nodding, and I know you've got experience in a number of dimensions on this. Do you want to jump in?
It's all right in terms of the family expectations, but also when the family is involved, and this is what we've all found, and people mentioned it throughout the last 2.5 hours, is that when the family is supportive, and the student is supported at home, and that can happen online, much more than it happened before COVID, then it has that positive impact on both the student and the family relationships between the child and the parent itself. So that's just one thing. I just think there are multiple ways in which we could involve different aspects of the economy, of the community, in terms of the possible funding of some kind of model. Like we have research, we have some models here already today that we heard about, but pulling in then the different aspects of our society who want a good civil society, who are ethical in terms of wanting their young people to have the best success that they can have, both in careers and in life outcomes. And it seems to me too that we have found in the last 2 years that in terms of supporting the Black community, we've had more and more businesses, the business world, coming in and saying, we have Black employees. They want us, they want to lead some work in terms of young people. What can you do? Like, this is just for Lifelong Leadership Institute, but I'm sure other community groups are getting that kind of invitational piece around some businesses. I don't think it's just finding the money in the education system. It has to do with the governing system and making it a priority, whereas other countries have done better than we have so far. But it's also speaking to the ethical leaders and then also channeling the support that many are willing to provide in a positive way, and funneling it to different needs, different groups, racialized groups, Indigenous, all of it has to be considered as a whole. And I think there's possibilities there. It is kind of a daunting job to think about doing that, but because it's daunting.
I'm in a business school, so my orientation is pretty instrumental in the sense that, I'm always trying to figure out like whose interests are being served. And I would argue that while there's a very strong social justice case for this, and it's critically important to understand that, to embrace that, the fact is there's also a very strong case to be made that, as Mohammed said, if you're worried about the underrepresentation of Black people in leadership roles and on boards, if we don't address this problem now, don't be surprised at what the workforce looks like in 5 years and 10 years. And certainly don't be whining about lack of representation in senior levels, because we have to invest upstream in order to produce those changes. So I personally think you're right, Linda, that there is interest in the employer side as well as in policy and educator spheres. I wonder if we've talked about the obstacles in terms of the costs. we've obliquely looked at jurisdictional issues and turf and you know, one size fits all and whose version is best and so on. But I wonder, Charles, because you tend to be you tend to be able to identify obstacles. Are there any other things that we haven't mentioned that we should be thinking about when we're looking for solutions? So where are the problems? What's going to prevent us from moving this forward? And then we'll look for the optimists.
I'll give you something that's optimistic to begin with, and I want to build on something that Dr. Daniel said earlier. And that is cross-age tutoring benefits both the tutor and the tutee. The tutor more than the tutee, by the way. The tutor learns in the course of preparing to work with the younger kid, and you can have all older kids work with younger kids in the process. They model, etc. They improve in math or reading, but they also are developing relationships. They're seeing competent older students whom they can emulate, etc., etc. Obstacles. If you're going to rely on the government of Canada, you have a problem because you have to launder the money that gets to the provinces. We do that already in education. The official languages in education money is laundered through the Council of Ministers of Education and then dispersed, so it doesn't look like it's coming from the feds. You have the problem within the provinces, I'll be blunt, of capacity at the provincial level. You have a problem between the provinces and school boards. Again, it's a capacity problem. And you also have, although you don't technically have a jurisdictional problem because school boards are creations of the provinces, you have a kind of a mythology of co-governors of the system that very likely could impede the successful application of any resource. In the case of Quebec, you have a province that if it was federal money is going to say, just give us the money, we'll decide how we use it, et cetera. So those are some of the practical obstacles. That's why I favor, I'm not opposed, obviously, to having the government of Canada pay for whatever it is folks decide to do. But I also like to see the provinces step up. I actually think if the provinces step up, that the bill will be less. It'll be primarily opportunity costs. You will have more universality, which is, I think, very desirable. I won't beat that dead horse. In school, cross-age tutoring is a much more efficacious way to go. In British Columbia, and in pretty much every other province, we have small communities with pockets of kids, and those communities can't even attract qualified teachers, and they have huge turnover, et cetera. So something coming in from the outside is not likely to work and is likely to exacerbate inequalities that we don't want to see happen. Thanks.
Philip, you want to elaborate more on first talk about obstacles and then be optimistic?
Well, I think the peer-to-peer model that Charles is talking about is quite interesting. We didn't look at it in our meta-analysis because there wasn't as many randomized controlled trials looking at it, but the potential for older students to help younger students, I agree that there seems to be like a potential wealth of resources there and a win-win on that. I do think that's where leveraging something like computer-assisted learning can help address the training issue, right? Not every student is a good person. So if they have some structure to follow, it might assist that. The research on tutoring, there seems to be more gains for reading at earlier ages and more gains for math at sort of older ages. the opportunity cost of, you know, trying to address reading weaknesses early and math weaknesses to kind of avoid that seem relatively, I don't know, I'm biased on the small, like I think we can find some space there, but you know, we have to give up something. But I think, again, it really seems important to leverage the school setting to ensure that it happens. That's why I sort of keep sticking on it as find it the time during schools, because leaving it to after school programs, the fraction that you're trying to reach will probably fall to like 5%. But so that I don't know if there's like good or, I think there's both good and bad in that those statements I just said.
So Philip's an economist, so he goes straight to skills, math, reading, and so on. I wonder, Linda, from your perspective, are there other dimensions that need to be addressed when we think about tutoring, apart from straight skills development?
Well, I think one of the really positive outcomes, and it's been mentioned by the others, is the students build self-confidence around whether it's reading or it's math or it's science, you know, whichever the subject area is. And I think, I can't remember, it was in the first panel, the word efficacy was used, and that's that sense of agency. And I think the parents mentioned that too, like how they're in some of the reports I've seen, how their son or daughter felt confident enough to actually risk, fail, but then go back to it after they've had a positive time, experiencing some good tutoring. And all of that, which is really contributes to the well-being of the students and their future, looking, you know, whether it's from a young age and then finally into high school, but also looking into secondary, post-secondary institutions. And I'm wondering, Dr. Beverly Daniels, if that is what you're finding in your research itself, like in terms of your research on post-secondary students from the Black community, what are some of the things that contributed to that in their K-12 learning?
So let me just clarify. Are you asking me what is it that led to the challenges in their learning, or because I think there's a part of the question that I maybe.
Well, I thought, you know, in terms of your studies, you're looking at post-secondary experiences by Black students, and what were and they're in university. What were the things that contributed them to going to that next step? Was there a tutoring experience? Was it other things that led to that? I'm trying to get back at, you know, what the investment is in terms of funding to have, whether it's Black students or Indigenous students or other students, the Portuguese students, be successful in whatever they choose beyond high school.
So there's a number of pieces that's emerging from the data. The first piece that we're looking at is sort of their relationships to schools. And what was really interesting in terms of doing some of the data analysis, what I found was that the reasons why females go on to post-secondary schooling is different from the reason why males go on, right? Males are going in when they're able to have these early relationships with mentors who identify that as a possibility. For the females, it was primarily the messages that they got from the family, right? So someone talked earlier about the role of families, but I think what we have not explored quite concretely is whether or not females and males respond in the same way. And what my research is saying is no, right? So even when we talk about families need to be more involved and more invested, what we're finding is that males are responding much more significantly to societal messages about their positioning and as well to what their peers are doing. Right. So I think when we even talk about programming, we may have to look at the ways in which we may have to develop programming that addresses those needs differently for male identified versus female identified students. The other piece that is becoming even more clear is the whole notion around them being able to cover the cost of schooling. Right, that is absolutely one of the biggest hurdles that the students are identifying. So in terms of the work that we do with the students, we support them in terms of applying for essentially every scholarship and bursary that comes up. And something like that may seem to be not a big deal. But when you think about the experiences that these students have had all through their educational career, which has been filled with so many minefields, they get into the post-secondary space, they're still experiencing varying forms of marginalization, they're still not positively represented in the curriculum, they're still having difficulties at developing positive relationships with professors, right? So even when these students are interested in applying for scholarships, who's there to guide them? Who's connecting them to these possibilities? Who's there to write reference letters for them, or to even edit a reference letter when they're interested in going on to advanced studies? So essentially, the same issues that we're seeing in the formative years, we're still seeing it in the post-secondary context. But I think people assume, which I will say that I myself did, that if our kids have made it into the post-secondary sector, that they have figured out how to navigate the systems and they're going to be okay. But that's not what the research is showing, right? That they get in there, they haven't been taught the formative skills that that Philip and Charles talked about. They haven't been taught the foundational skills. So now they're, again, floundering. But the difficult piece, or the additional difficult piece around the floundering, is the fact that many of the students are having to borrow money from OSAP to pay for their schooling. And if they are removed from schools, or if they are withdrawn from schools, they're now left with a lot of debt, but no degree, right? So that's another sort of layer that gets added on. So in terms of how they're succeeding, what we're finding is that the students who have developed a much clearer sense of their racial identity, they're able to challenge the stereotypical ideas around Blackness. They're less impacted by sort of the stereotype threat and this sense that they must work 10 times as hard to get ahead. They've been able to connect with other students who are in their same areas and are doing well. But also in terms of the programming that we provide, we address a range of areas. We address communication skills, we address racial identity development, we provide career mentoring and networks for them. So essentially what the students get is a go-to spot where they can ask all the questions, they can learn how to do things differently, and then we make references to connect them to different support systems. So very long answer, Linda, but I hope I've answered your question.
Well, I think I think, Beverly, what you raised, and I think this is important. I live in the Future Skills Center. My world is future skills. But very often when people think about skills, they are thinking about what we would define as skill for success, digital literacy and reading and mathematics and so on. All of those things are important. We know that they lay a foundation. But often what doesn't get as much attention, and I think, Beverly, you've identified this, and so have you, Linda, are the issues around self-efficacy, the issues around resilience and capacity that have more to do with social capital and other kinds of competencies that are not so easily measured. And I guess one of the things that I think is kind of the dirty secret in all of this is the role of socioeconomic status, the role of what you have at home in terms of the social capital and the people who are supporting you and helping you navigate your pathway. And the work that we've done, and I know, Philip, you've done lots too, for example, with newcomer families, is they may have the skills from a pure competency perspective, but it's the knowledge of how to navigate the social networks that will get you from A to B, and the people that they can rely on to help them do that, that is often where we see barriers to success. And so, you know, the thing that I'm trying to, I guess, draw out of the discussion is when we think of tutoring or when we think of interventions to help students succeed in school, we do have to think about ensuring that they will do well on standardized tests and that they have those measurable reading, writing, arithmetic, digital skills, and so on, because those are foundational. But it's other stuff that rich kids get almost by osmosis that poor kids often don't get. And given the intersections between indigeneity, race, and other dimensions of diversity and socioeconomic status, we often overlook how those the factors that build confidence and self-efficacy are often based on relationships, not information, not knowledge, but belief in yourself. And that's something that I think you can get in these one-on-one relationships in a way that often you can't get in larger group settings. So, and whether that comes from someone who's just a couple of years older than you, who's encouraging you, who's setting an example, who's a role model, or whether that comes from someone who's formally trained, those relationships I think are super important and often overlooked. I am supposed to wrap up now, but I wanted to just see if there's anything else that this panel would like to raise before we conclude the session. I thought it was really interesting and incredibly helpful, and Karen and Kelly certainly laid amazing groundwork for this. Charles, I don't want to.
I'd like to apologize for channeling my inner economist. And I would like to ask Dr. Daniel not to report me to the sociologist, because I'm really a sociologist. I've really enjoyed this very much. Thanks very much.
Philip, any last words from you?
Well, as already have an inner economist me, but anyway, I was going to say, Wendy, I think you're talking about a more expensive program, so you can layer it on top of tutoring, coaching, just like Pathways to Education sort of seems to do. And then you're looking at an envelope of services to try to do this. You know, certainly there's the potential that tutors might play a role model, but not always. You know, their objective is a little bit different, but you know, there's always coaching programs that can be added on to something like this. So we'll just ask for more resources to make all that happen.
And Linda, Beverly,
I want to add the whole mentorship idea that Beverly mentioned as well. In terms of what this might look like, it is complex. It could be doable with the right kind of infrastructure and the right kind of leadership, and leadership at all levels, from the children right through the various sections of our society itself. So I'm leaving on that particular note, but I don't want to be called Pollyanna, okay?
It's a welcome ray of sunshine in this particular time. Beverly, last word to you.
I would say that based on the work that I've been doing, the change is very, very possible. So I don't see it as being Pollyanna-ish. When I think of the almost 2,000 students that we've prevented or supported in terms of completing college and university degrees, and the fact that some of them are now in law school, some of them are completing PhDs, some of them are in their master's programs. The work is doable with the right kinds of support. And part of the work as well is that we have to think about, given that these students are Canadian citizens, how do we support them in terms of accessing supports that are available in the broader society, as opposed to only being able to provide it in sort of these closed settings. I think the closed setting is a really good place to support their identity development, and to give them that core sense of capacity and well-being being. But that then also sets a really amazing springboard for them to be able to go into other places and become leaders in those spaces. So the work is very, very doable. And so maybe I'm also being Pollyanna-ish, but I think it's very doable.
I love that as a note to end on. And I want to just take a moment to thank the Future Skills Center for funding the program, to thank Karen and Kelly for the work that they did in laying the groundwork, bringing together many of these groups, everyone who's participated today as a panelist and fueled the rich discussion. And the thing that I would simply leave us with is that, in my mind, this is not an education policy issue. This is an issue that impacts economic development, social inclusion, even our infrastructure. And so it seems to me that if we think of this as something that is laying a foundation for prosperity and social justice in Canada, and get out of thinking this as just the school's problem or the ministries of education's problem or the principal's problem, and think about this as an investment in our future, that also brings to the table a lot more resources. It makes it more complex to navigate, but I think it also opens up opportunities and possibilities to actually turn this into reality. So thank you very much for all the ideas, and it's been recorded, it's been transcribed, there'll be more to follow, and we look forward to working with all of you as we take this forward. Thank you very, very much.